History loves loud names. Artists who shouted through their work. Men whose lives were written again and again. But some geniuses didn't shout. They whispered, and history almost didn't listen. In the late 16th century, in the heart of Milan, while Europe was still debating whether women could even be artists, a young woman was already doing something extraordinary. She was painting reality with terrifying precision. Glass that looked fragile enough to shatter. Fruit so real it felt ripe. Light reflected so perfectly it forced viewers to stop and stare. Her name was Fede Galizia, and for centuries, she was nearly forgotten. Fede Galizia did not paint grand battles. She did not lead movements. She did not scandalize courts. Instead, she did something far more radical for her time. She mastered still life before Italy even recognized it as an art form. At a time when history painting was considered the highest achievement and still life was dismissed as decorative, minor, almost meaningless, Fede Galizia turned bowls of fruit, glass vessels, and simple objects into silent statements of control, skill, and intellect. Born around 1578, she grew up surrounded by art, trained by her miniaturist father, and praised as a prodigy while still a teenager. But talent was not enough, because she was a woman. Every brushstroke had to be perfect. Every painting had to justify her existence. And she succeeded. Collectors admired her work. Courts respected her skill. Other artists quietly studied her technique. Yet when art history was written centuries later, her name faded into footnotes, while others, often less precise, took center stage. This is not just the story of a painter. It is the story of how quiet brilliance is often erased, how innovation without noise is overlooked, and how one woman shaped an entire genre without ever being given the credit she deserved. Today we bring her back. This is Fede Galizia, the pioneer of Italian still life, the artist history almost ignored. And once you truly see her work, you'll never understand how she was forgotten. Fact 1. Born into art, Fede Galizia's beginning. Fede Galizia was born around 1578 in Milan, at a time when art was not simply decoration, but a language of power, religion, and identity. She did not grow up surrounded by silence. She grew up surrounded by brushes, pigments, and miniature worlds. Her father, Nunzio Galizia, was a professional miniaturist, an artist whose work demanded extreme precision, patience, and an eye trained to see beauty in the smallest possible details. From a very young age, Fede watched art being built slowly, stroke by stroke, detail by detail. While other children learned to read and write, she learned how light touches glass, how color changes on metal, and how a single mistake could ruin an entire miniature. This environment shaped her forever. Miniature painting was not about speed or drama. It was about control, discipline, and observation. And those qualities would later become the foundation of Fede Galizia's unmistakable style. Growing up in her father's workshop meant that art was never distant or abstract. It was daily life. She handled brushes before most girls were allowed to imagine a professional future at all. By the time she was a teenager, her talent was already being noticed. Not as a curiosity, but as something serious, something rare. Her early exposure to art did not make her famous overnight, but it gave her something far more important, a mastery of detail that few artists, men or women, could match. And that mastery began here, in Milan, inside a miniature painter's workshop, long before history was ready to remember her name. Fact 2. A child prodigy in a man's world. By the time Fede Galizia reached her teenage years, it was already clear that she was not simply talented, she was exceptional. In an era when women were rarely trained seriously as artists, her work began to attract attention from scholars, collectors, and even male painters who quietly acknowledged her skill. What made this remarkable was not only her age, but the confidence of her execution. Her lines were steady, her compositions controlled. There was no hesitation in her hand. Art writers of the late 16th century described her as a young woman of extraordinary ability, a phrase rarely used for female artists at the time. She was not praised as a novelty. She was praised as a professional. This early recognition mattered because it allowed her to continue painting in a world that constantly questioned whether women belonged in the studio at all. Fede Galizia did not ask for permission. Her work answered the question before it was even asked. Fact 3. A pioneer of Italian still life. At the end of the 16th century, still life painting was not considered important. It was decorative, secondary, almost invisible to art history. But Fede Galizia saw something else. She understood that objects could speak, fruit could age, glass could reflect truth, metal could reveal light and time. While many artists focused on grand religious scenes, she chose bowls, plates, and simple arrangements, and turned them into works of astonishing realism. Her still lifes are among the earliest known examples of the genre in Italy. This makes her not a follower, but a pioneer. She helped define a genre before it was even officially recognized. And she did so quietly, without manifestos, without movements, only with precision. Fact 4. Master of precision and realism. What truly sets Fede Galizia apart is not only what she painted, but how she painted. Every surface in her work feels intentional. Glass reflects light with mathematical accuracy. Metal shines without exaggeration. Fruit appears heavy, ripe, and fragile. This level of realism was not accidental. It came from years of discipline, from miniature training, and from an obsessive attention to detail that few artists could sustain. Her paintings invite the viewer to slow down, to look closer, to notice the smallest imperfections, because those imperfections are what make the image real. In a time when drama often overshadowed accuracy, Fede Galizia chose control over chaos, and in doing so, she created works that still feel modern centuries later. Fact 5. Hidden symbolism, beauty, time, and mortality. At first glance, Fede Galizia's paintings appear calm, beautiful, and perfectly balanced. Fruit rests quietly in bowls. Glass vessels shine softly. Nothing moves. Nothing screams for attention. But this silence is intentional, because beneath the surface of her still lifes lies a deeper language. One that speaks about time, fragility, and mortality. In the late Renaissance and early Baroque period, artists often used everyday objects to communicate ideas that words could not. This tradition is known as symbolism, and in still life painting, it would later become famous as vanitas, a reminder that all beauty fades. Fede Galizia was among the earliest artists in Italy to use this visual language with precision and restraint. Look closely at her fruit. They are ripe, sometimes almost too ripe. Small imperfections appear on the skin. Leaves curl slightly. A sense of time passing is quietly embedded in the image. This is not accidental. Ripeness suggests abundance and beauty, but decay suggests something else. Nothing lasts. Glass plays a crucial role in her symbolism. Transparent yet fragile, glass reflects the world while remaining easily breakable. It becomes a metaphor for human life, clear, precious, and vulnerable. Metal bowls and plates, often polished and reflective, stand in contrast to organic fruit. They represent permanence, while nature slowly changes beside them. Together, these objects create tension between what endures and what inevitably fades. What makes Fede Galizia's symbolism remarkable is how quietly it speaks. There are no skulls, no dramatic gestures, no obvious warnings. Instead, the message unfolds slowly, only for those willing to look closely. Her paintings do not demand fear. They invite reflection. They ask the viewer to pause, to notice, and to think. For a woman artist in her time, this subtlety mattered. She did not preach. She did not provoke openly. She embedded philosophy into beauty. And by doing so, she transformed still life painting from decoration into contemplation. Fact 5 reminds us that Fede Galizia was not only a master of technique, but a thinker, an artist who understood that art could whisper truths louder than words ever could. And centuries later, those whispers are still being heard. Fact 6. Choosing independence in a world that expected silence. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, a woman's life was rarely her own to design. Marriage was not a choice, it was an expectation. For most women, it marked the end of personal ambition, the quiet closure of individual identity, and the beginning of a life defined by duty rather than desire. Fede Galizia chose differently. Unlike many women of her time, Fede Galizia never married, a decision that would have appeared unusual, even suspicious, in a society where a woman's value was often measured by her role as a wife and mother rather than as a creator. But this choice was not an act of rebellion in the modern sense. It was something far more deliberate. It was a decision to protect her work. Marriage in early modern Italy often meant the loss of professional autonomy. A married woman's time, labor, and income were legally and socially absorbed into her husband's authority. For an artist, this could be devastating. It meant fewer commissions, less control, and often the slow disappearance of a career. By remaining unmarried, Fede Galizia preserved something essential: independence. This independence allowed her to control her schedule, choose her subjects, and refine her technique without interruption. It gave her the space to work patiently, to obsess over detail, and to pursue perfection without compromise. In a world that rarely allowed women the luxury of focus, Fede Galizia carved out a life centered entirely around her art. What makes this even more remarkable is that she achieved recognition without conforming to the traditional paths available to women. She did not rely on marriage to secure status. She did not attach her career to a male artist's name. Her reputation rested solely on her skill. That alone was revolutionary. Yet her independence came at a cost. Without marriage, she existed on the margins of historical documentation. She left no children to preserve her memory, no family name carried forward through generations. And when art history was later written, often by men, often focused on dynasties and lineages, artists like Fede Galizia were easier to overlook. Still, her choice speaks loudly across centuries. In a time when silence was safer than ambition, she chose focus over conformity. In a world that expected women to disappear into domestic life, she remained visible, not through scandal, but through discipline. Her independence was quiet, but it was absolute. Fact 6 reminds us that Fede Galizia's legacy is not only found in her paintings, but in the life she deliberately constructed around them. She did not wait for permission. She built a life where art came first and accepted the consequences with resolve. And in doing so, she left behind a body of work that speaks for a woman who chose creation over expectation. Fact 7, recognized in her own time. Despite the limitations placed on women artists in early modern Europe, Fede Galizia achieved something rare. She was recognized during her lifetime. By the early 17th century, her work had gained respect beyond Milan, reaching collectors who valued precision, realism, and disciplined technique over dramatic excess. Her still-life paintings were admired not as decorative objects, but as serious works of art. This mattered, because women artists were often praised as curiosities, if they were acknowledged at all. Galizia was different. Contemporary writers mentioned her by name, placing her alongside respected male painters of the period. Her art was judged by quality, not gender. She achieved recognition without court patronage, without powerful family connections, and without marriage to secure social status. Her reputation rested entirely on her skill. Yet over time, as art history began favoring louder styles and grand narratives, her quiet mastery faded from public memory. Fact 7 reminds us that being forgotten later does not mean being ignored then. Fede Galizia was seen, she was respected, and she deserved to be remembered.
Fact 8. Death. During the plague of 1630, in the year 1630, northern Italy was struck by one of the deadliest outbreaks of plague in its history. Cities emptied, workshops fell silent, artists, scholars, and ordinary people disappeared overnight. Fede Galizia was among them. She died during this devastating plague at a time when fear and uncertainty dominated everyday life. There was no dramatic ending, no final masterpiece announced to the world. Her life ended quietly, as many lives did during that year. Yet the timing is painfully symbolic. An artist whose work reflected fragility, impermanence, and the passage of time was claimed by the very forces she painted so subtly. Her death marked the sudden end of one of the most precise artistic voices of the early Baroque period. Fact 9. Why her legacy faded. Fede Galizia did not disappear because her art lacked value. She disappeared because history often favors noise. She left no artistic dynasty, no workshop filled with students, no children to preserve her name. As art history was later written, focus shifted toward grand movements, bold personalities, and dramatic narratives. Galizia's work was quiet, controlled, subtle, and subtlety is easy to overlook. Her paintings survived, but her story slowly faded from textbooks and galleries. Not erased, just ignored. Fact 10. Her rediscovery and modern recognition. Today, Fede Galizia is no longer silent. Art historians have begun to re-examine her work, recognizing her as a pioneer of Italian still life and one of the most technically refined painters of her era. Her paintings now appear in major museums, studied not as curiosities but as foundational works. What was once overlooked is now re-evaluated. And in this rediscovery, her legacy finally begins to align with her true importance. Fact 10 is not about the past, it is about correction, because history does not always remember correctly, but it can learn to look again. So here we are, at the end of 10 facts, but not at the end of her story. Fede Galizia lived in a world that rarely remembered women by name. She didn't lead armies. She didn't sit on thrones. She held a brush, and with it, she quietly challenged an entire era. While history celebrated loud geniuses and powerful men, Fede painted in silence. Still lifes that felt alive, faces that stared back at the viewer, calm, sharp, unforgettable. She didn't need scandal to be remembered. She didn't need rebellion to be revolutionary. Her art spoke softly, but it endured, and that may be the most powerful kind of legacy, because centuries later we are still looking at her work, still talking about her name, still rediscovering what history once overlooked. Fede Galizia reminds us that greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. If you believe forgotten artists deserve to be remembered, if you love uncovering hidden stories from history, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. More lost geniuses, more untold stories, more history they never taught us. Like the video, share it with someone who loves art and history, and comment below, which forgotten artist should we explore next? History hides many voices. We're here to bring them back. But her story doesn't end here. For centuries, Fede Galizia stood in the shadows, not because her art lacked power, but because history chose not to look. Every painting she left behind is a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that talent doesn't disappear. It only waits to be rediscovered. If this story made you see history differently, don't let it end with this video. Subscribe for more forgotten artists, hidden geniuses, and the stories history tried to erase. Because some voices were never meant to be silent, and we're just getting started.